I think we're ready to go. I see we're at the 3:30 mark. Once again, I'm Brian Himmelblum, your moderator for Zoom Room A. We have another great panel discussion coming up for the next 60 minutes. So I'm going to turn it over to, let's see, Aaron. I think I turn it over to you. You're the chief, and then you can take it away. Thank you.
Sounds great. Well, I'm coordinating this, but all of us contributed, and I'm really excited to be here and talk with you all today. Should I share my own screen and presentation?
I believe so. That'd be fine.
Let me get that together then. And I have a cat that is about to try to photobomb. Let's see. I have far too many windows open too. So let me go ahead and apologize, share screen. And let's see. Are you seeing the presenter view or the
You got the full screen. Yeah, looks great.
Okay, awesome. Well, hello everybody, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Erin Shu, and I am the Climate Change Coordinator at Chugach Regional Resources Commission, or SERC. Today, I'm joined by my colleagues. Allison Carl is a staff scientist. Raven Cunningham is our Marine Mammal Program Manager, and Stephen Payton is our IGAP, Indian General Assistance Program Coordinator. So today we're going to provide an overview of our climate change program and our vulnerability assessment, which we are just starting to wrap up. Our vulnerability assessment focuses on the impacts climate change has on subsistence resources in our region. So climate change and food sovereignty are two common themes that run throughout most of SERC's programs. So we'll go through the draft results of the vulnerability assessment, and then my colleagues are going to highlight some of the programs that we are working on to address that intersection of climate and food security and food sovereignty. So first, I'd like to give a little bit of background about SERC. We are an intertribal natural resource management and economic development nonprofit. We were formed in 1984 to serve the tribes of the Chugach region. So here you can see a map of our region and the 7 communities we represent. That's Nanwalik and Port Graham on the southern Kenai Peninsula, and then Katuchik Native Tribe in Seward, Chiniga, Native Village of Eyak, Tutitlik, and Valdez Native Tribe in Prince William Sound. So as our mission statement says, SERC, sorry, my cat's attacking me, go away, I'm gonna have to lock you out of the room. So as our mission statement says, SERC works to promote tribal sovereignty and the protection of our subsistence lifestyle, and to assure the conservation, sustainable economic development, and stewardship of the natural resources in the traditional use area of the Chugach region. So we operate the Alutiiq Pride Marine Institute out of Seward, which started as a shellfish hatchery to supplement subsistence resources, and has since grown to conduct research on the marine environment of Prince William Sound. And our board of directors consists of one member from each of SERC's tribal communities, and they provide guidance and direction on the research and programs that SERC undertakes. So a little bit more about our climate change program. It started in 2014 when our board directed us to better understand how climate change would impact tribal communities and how to prepare for and mitigate unwanted impacts. So we've divided it into 3 phases. The first we completed in 2015, and it helped build capacity and understanding within SERC about climate change and what programs were out there to help address it, especially for tribes. So we completed an analysis of those programs that we've used as a basis for this program. And in 2019, we received funding for phase 2, which is to develop a vulnerability assessment focusing on impacts to subsistence in our region. So this was originally intended to be finished a little bit sooner than it has been, but unfortunately the pandemic interrupted our work. And so it's lasted a little bit longer than we initially expected, as we have made several pivots to deal with the changing conditions. So yes, so far we've completed a draft of the vulnerability assessment, and we'll be sharing those results with you today. And over the next month, we're going to be soliciting feedback from tribal citizens and finalizing it. So I do want to put the disclaimer out there that the information I'm sharing with you is draft. It's considered preliminary, and it may change with additional feedback and input from our tribes. So also in the next month, we'll begin transitioning into phase 3 that you can see up here, which is to develop health monitoring and climate adaptation plans to understand what direction we want to go in our region, and also how we're going to measure health and well-being in relation to climate change and climate impacts. So a little bit about how we did this project. So we based our vulnerability assessment on the Institute for Tribal Environmental Professionals Adaptation Planning Toolkit. And this is where this matrix that you can see in the lower part of the screen, that's based off of that ITEP planning kit. We altered our matrix and kind of the questions and framework of ours to focus a little bit more heavily on subsistence resources, because there's been a lot of good research done on geophysical or geochemical and physical changes that might happen in our region. There was a 2017 Chugach National Forest Vulnerability Assessment that the Forest Service put out that has a lot of great data in it. And there's also these, SNAP community climate charts that project future precipitation and temperature changes in communities around Alaska. But what we discovered in doing kind of some of this literature research is there's not a lot of focus on how humans are going to, or how people are going to be impacted. It's more about the landscapes. And so we felt that this was an important gap that needs to be filled for management considerations. So as I mentioned, our method shifted midway through our work thanks to the pandemic. We originally had planned to travel to each community and hold public meetings in all of them. We printed out a large banner that you can see the image that we used for it here. It depicts the most important subsistence resources in our region. It was developed from a food security assessment project that SERC completed in 2018. And it shows kind of the progression of subsistence harvest over the years. So it starts with spring on the left and moves through winter on the right. So before the pandemic hit, we were able to travel to 3 of our communities and hold those public meetings. So we went to Port Graham in December 2019, Chuniga, which you can see a picture of Chuniga here, in February 2020, and to Seward to meet with the Chugach tribe in March 2020. So we asked community members at the community meetings to assign different colored post-its to species based on the risk that they felt the species had from climate change. So green post-its were low risk, yellow medium risk, and red were high risk. We also asked people to think about how much changes, abundance, or the distribution of those species would affect people's livelihoods on a scale of 1 to 10. We had 1 being no noticeable impact and 10 being a life-altering impact, like needing to change jobs or move away to a different community. So this is how we assess kind of how that human component. So we then asked follow-up questions to better understand why respondents assigned the risk and impact numbers they chose. And that also helped fill in that matrix that I showed before. There was also, we also conducted a literature review and developed species sheets about all of these species to better understand what literature was saying, how climate might impact them. After the pandemic started and we had to shut down travel, we switched to using an online survey program. So we used a program called Alchemar to develop a survey that was attempting to mimic these community meetings. We had that open for 4 months between July 2020 and October 2020 and received 13 responses. So we integrated the survey responses with the data from our community meetings to develop the results that we're going to show you here. Really quickly, I wanted to go over kind of what is happening or what's predicted to happen in our region, and then we'll dive into the results. So decision-making in conditions of uncertainty is difficult, but in the case of climate change, it's necessary. So globally, according to the Climate Action Tracker, current global warming is likely to reach 2.7 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. That's 4.8 degrees Fahrenheit. And a 2022 report by the International Panel on Climate Change warned of extreme risk to ecosystems at temperature increases above 1.5 degrees Celsius. Research by climate scientists predicts that in south central Alaska, we're likely to experience an additional 3 degrees Celsius of warming over the next 50 years on top of the 1.9 degrees Celsius degree change that has already happened. And I have this image up here. I really like it. It's a little bit older of a projection, but it looks at biomes, which are collections or assemblages of plants that tend to grow together at certain combinations of temperature and precipitation. And so you can really see kind of the, oops, sorry, didn't mean to do that, the drastic change that could potentially occur here. And this was run under a mid-range scenario that estimates about, I think it's 2.8 degrees, kind of the average for change by 2100. So that's actually kind of in line with the track we're on right now. Just a couple of things to note in this projection are that tundra environments are disappearing in south central Alaska. That's a lot of the green and the purple and the dark blue that you, sorry, not the green, the purple and the dark blue that you see on this image. The forests expand in Prince William Sound and the southern Kenai. You see that shift from more of a mixed boreal forest in the dark blue to the pink, which is a very dense forested southern boreal environment. And there's also a large shift on the Kenai, a potential shift on the Kenai, where it might go from kind of the mixed boreal forest we know today to more of a grassland area. And again, these are just predictions, but it does show that there's there could be very drastic changes in some areas and not so drastic changes in others. So there's a lot of uncertainty, but things are changing. And here's some of the predicted changes that I mentioned from the literature that we read through. Oops. So climate change can have very direct impacts on food sovereignty and food security in our region. So according to a USDA report, the average American eats 1,996 pounds of food a year, including 185 pounds of meat. So this graph shows the per capita average consumption of wild foods in our communities between 1985 and 2017. So you can see that wild foods contributes a lot to individual food security in our region. Accessing to these traditional foods is vital to food security, but climate threatens both these resources and people's ability to harvest them. Some of these threats include temperature changes that can cause heat stress, that can cause direct mortality events to subsistence foods, particularly in marine species. People have noticed an extended growing season and earlier spring that could lead to chronological mismatch when food is available and when animals need it. Adaptation also directly impacts people, plants, and animals. People talked a lot about drought in particular and concerns about fish and water supplies. Too much water can also be a problem. Flooding and erosion can threaten community infrastructure and can also directly impact plants and animals. Ocean acidification has all sorts of impacts that we're just starting to understand, from making it more difficult for marine invertebrates to grow shells, to interfering potentially with the olfactory senses that return to their natal streams. We're witnessing new disease vectors through, for example, as ice recedes, there's been evidence that there's been disease transmission between marine mammals on the East Coast and in Alaska. There's also just likely going to be cascading impacts on the food web because impacts to one species effect can have broader implications. There's also a lot of uncertainty and concern about how climate will interact with other stressors, especially contamination. Our area remembers the Exxon Valdez oil spill very well. People still have that very fresh in their memory. So that's kind of an overview of what people were saying and what our project is. So I will turn it over to my colleague Allison to talk a little bit about the results. And Allison, just let me know when you want me to change the slide.
Okay, sounds good. Thank you, Erin. Let's see. So community members reported a number of concerning observations. The chart here is showing the overall risk and impact on subsistence resources reported by Chugach harvesters. The x-axis is the perceived risk to the resource from climate change on a scale of 1 to 3, and then the y-axis represents how much people think changes to those resources would impact them. In the upper right-hand quadrant, we have the species that are perceived as highly at risk to climate change and important to people's livelihoods, whereas the lower left quadrant are the species with the least perceived risk and impact from climate change. The species that are at high risk to climate change but aren't central to people's livelihoods are in the lower right-hand quadrant, and then the species that are important to people's livelihoods but not perceived as being at high risk to climate change are in the upper left quadrant. So we'll go more into detail about these rankings in just a minute, but first we really wanted to highlight a couple of trends. So people are highly concerned about the impacts of invasive species. As you can see, they're all ranked high on the high risk quadrant. This is because people are already seeing these species appearing in the region. So for example, warmer winters have led to spruce bark beetle outbreaks. This can decimate huge swaths of forest and create prime conditions for wildfires, which then in turn can displace people, cause property damage, property loss, reduce local air quality, and potentially decimate wildlife. And then similarly, people are concerned about fleas and ticks, which can serve as vectors for disease currently not found in Alaska. And additionally, like spruce bark beetles, warmer winter temperatures could lead to overwhelming number of insects, like what we see in the lower 48 with winter tick infestations and moose. And then another just general trend that we see here is the marine species generally ranking higher on the risk diagram than terrestrial species. And this really just demonstrates the importance of marine and intertidal species to the people of the Chugach region, who have the saying, when the tide is out, the table's set. And then community members named a number of changes that they had already observed throughout the region. These include hotter, drier summers, warmer winters with less snow, shorter winters, and shorter winters overall. And then they described large algal blooms, both in fresh and marine waters, which made them concerned for the health of important subsistence species, and then fearful of toxins in traditional foods. Warm, shallow waters in creeks and streams in the summer can threaten riparian organisms, which are adapted to cold water streams bolstered by glacier runoff. And then throughout the region, glacial retreat has accelerated and storms have gotten stronger, which can lead to the potential for landslides, erosion, and can release oil trapped after the Exxon Valdez oil spill, as well as have the potential of direct impacts on infrastructure that protect community safety. Next slide. Okay, so the next couple of slides, we're going to break it down, the responses by harvest category. So salmon, they're an incredibly important resource for this region. It constitutes about 1/3 to 1/2 of subsistence harvest in the region, depending on the community. Overall, there is a large concern for the future viability of this resource if water temperatures keep rising, both in the ocean and in streams. Respondents noted a decreased abundance of many species of salmon and expressed concern for warm, shallow waters that are impacting salmon's ability to reach their spawning grounds and the survival of fry. Others expressed concerns about how climate change was altering the timing of the natural system. Individuals in Chugach had noted that when they have a mild winter, the critical temperatures in a stream are reached sooner, and then outmigration of smolt happens in March rather than April, as it should happen. And then the plankton that the smolt depend on aren't there during March. Residents of all communities stress the importance of salmon for food and income and express concerns about the long-term viability of the communities. In the communities without salmon. One respondent said, if changes in outmigration patterns continue, then in 2 or 3 years, this place is going to be in bad shape. Sockeye salmon and king salmon were ranked considerably lower to vulnerability overall to the effect of climate change because respondents felt that they have the adaptive capacity in changing conditions compared to other salmon species. Next slide. Non-salmon fish. So non-salmon fish are an important part of the region's diet as well. In many communities, it makes up nearly the same amount of edible weight as salmon. Residents describe a number of factors affecting non-salmon fish. Some are climate change related, and then others are from additional stressors that may reduce species adaptive capacity in a changing climate. So residents described high level of concern for halibut in particular. They noted that halibut were getting smaller, less abundant, and then their flesh was changing, becoming mushier and more transparent. Many also expressed concern about fishing pressure in Ketchikan Bay and in Prince William Sound, and acknowledging that the overfishing wasn't related to climate change, but it does add additional stressor to fish species. And then herring roe and herring roe on kelp were once a really important subsistence and commercial resource in the region, but it was going at a gradual decline until the 1980s and then crashed completely after the Exxon Valdez oil spill and never fully recovered. Although residents have reported seeing more herring and roe in recent years, they expressed continued concern for the species and noted that herring are super sensitive to warming waters. They described finding blemishes and other signs of sick fish in the subsistence herring harvest and speculated that there could be a cascading impact to the ecosystem from continued lowering numbers of herring, and that herring are really an important food fish for other species, and removing them from the system can take out a lot of nutrients from the environment. Port Graham had expressed a similar concern about Pacific tomcods, which are a locally important subsistence species. Residents noted that tomcods are also very sensitive to water temperature, as well as being an important forage fish. And then while most of the comments on non-salmon fish are focused on marine fish, one survey respondent did note that there was a concern about invasive northern pike getting into the lake systems on the Kenai and then impacting native fish species. Respondents also described large green algal blooms in streams that they were worried might impact fish, and in particular the stickleback and the trout fry. Next slide. So in general, marine invertebrates are rated as highly vulnerable to climate change and have traditionally been a huge component for, again, both subsistence and commercial harvests. Interestingly, jellyfish are rated as high concern because of their increasing abundance. Community members from both Ketchikan Bay and Prince William Sound have reported or had reported seeing huge increases in the number of jellyfish washing up on beaches and also in the water column, and expressed concerns that those huge numbers were either impacting marine ecosystems or could be a result from changing marine ecosystems or a combination of both. So respondents, also reported decreasing numbers of many shellfish species, and they're concerned about over-harvesting combined with climate change permanently affecting shellfish populations. And many people felt that even without the abundance issue, many types of shellfish are no longer safe to eat with the threat of toxic contaminants and the risk of paralytic shellfish poisoning from harmful algal blooms. And then there was also an observed decrease in size and abundance of octopus. That was contributed to over-harvest rather than climate change. And some communities were even describing doing a voluntary halt on octopus harvest until populations rebound. Next slide. Marine mammals were also once an incredibly important source of traditional food for the region, but harvest declined sharply after the oil spill and then only slowly started rebounding. Seals, primarily harbor seals, were the marine mammal considered most at risk by community members due to receding glaciers and concerns about less sea ice. Respondents reported seeing fewer seals in the last 5 to 10 years, and that the seals that they were able to harvest were appearing skinnier than usual. Respondents also said that changes to abundance of seals and their ability to harvest them was having a huge impact on their livelihoods. People were unable to eat seal meat, and young people weren't learning how to hunt them. Seals an important traditional diet, and it provides essential nutrients and connection to culture and community. Sea otters are primarily targeted for their pelts, which can also provide an important income for fur sores. However, respondents noted that they'd been increasing in numbers over the past several decades and even became more aggressive. And people were concerned about competition for other important species like fish and shellfish, noting that clam declines coincided with the resurgence of sea otter populations. And fewer people spoke about sea lions, but noted that they had observed large haulouts on rocks during the summer months in the last few years, and wondered if that was maybe due to receding glaciers and fewer ice chunks in the ocean. And many respondents again noted young people weren't learning to hunt marine mammals anymore, and they were just worried about the continuation of these traditions and what that would mean for their communities. Next slide. Land mammals have been an increasingly important and threatened part of the modern subsistence diet in the Chugach region. Ungulates like moose, deer, and mountain goats, they're all an important game species that face climate threats in a changing environment. So moose and especially deer are a staple in the region, and respondents noted that their numbers have been decreasing over the years. So while over-harvest and competition with other hunters was a primary concern, residents also noticed that increasingly severe winter storms have a major impact on moose and deer, making them more difficult for them to escape predators and to find food. And as climate change extends the growing season, respondents said it's increasingly difficult to harvest moose in the fall, with the average kill date getting later and later every year. Respondents noted that mountain goats are also locally at risk from climate change as their habitats diminish. As alders and other shrubs move higher in elevation, the intermittent pockets of tundra that mountain goats rely on for food have started to shrink. And then people generally agreed that bears were at low risk from climate change, but noted that they had seen fewer of them recently. People expressed concern about safety. So if climate change is impacting bears' food sources, it may end up forcing them into towns and communities in search of food. Residents in one community did note that in 2019, which was a really bad year for berries and fish, they had to shoot like a unusually large number of bears for safety purposes. And then additionally, respondents reported that increased sightings of small predators like wolverine and lynx, and were wondering if food stress is what was forcing them into more populated areas as well. Next slide, perfect. So archaeological evidence shows that birds and eggs were historically a really vital source for during the spring months when other food sources were scarce. But the 1918 Migratory Bird Treaty Act actually banned the spring harvest of birds and eggs. So as a result of this act, many of these traditions have not been passed down through the generations like some other subsistence traditions have. Birds and eggs constitute about 1 to 2% of the harvested food in the region. Concerns about birds were primarily expressed in terms of how bird health correlated to greater environmental health. So for example, respondents rated seabirds like murres as highly vulnerable to climate change. And that's been shown in recent die-offs, and that seemed to be starvation related, but they were more concerned about what that meant for important forage fish that people depend on for food and income. And in general, people talk about seeing recent mass die-offs and fewer numbers of birds overall, particularly for seabirds, geese, and ducks. And in recent years, some areas have volunteered to stop harvesting eggs to help populations to bounce back. In addition, in Prince William Sound, residents expressed a concern about birds eating barnacles and other prey which may contain residual oil. And then the ptarmigan and grouse are also being affected by climate change. So like other species that depend on tundra environments, their habitats are disappearing in south-central Alaska. Residents have reported seeing fewer and smaller flocks when they're out hunting, and then also noticed that the phenological mismatch were becoming more common for ptarmigan, increasing their vulnerability to predation. And then next, plants and berries. So plants account for about 3 to 7% of the total edible harvest in the Chugach region. Climate change will likely mean longer growing seasons for the region, but numerous conditions affect the abundance of edible plants and berries. So as noted in the climate biome slide from earlier, some habitats may disappear completely from this region, reducing suitable habitat for some plants. Residents have already noted alders and other shrubs growing at higher elevations. And communities on the Kenai Peninsula have noted, have experienced dry conditions over the past few years, which have impacted berries and in particular blueberries. Harvesters noted that the blueberries are wormier when they are available to harvest, and then they're worried that the pests are going to become more prevalent with increasing temperatures. Harvesters also noted that it's becoming harder to predict a good berry year, and they just kind of seem to come and go. And some berries, like salmon berries, have a shorter harvesting period when the temperatures are warmer. Respondents also noted that fall berries, like cranberries, may actually have a longer harvesting season with changing conditions. And then some respondents were worried that drier conditions might impact the harvestability of fiddlehead ferns. Changing fire regimes also impact harvest availability. So respondents noted that fireweed had been growing abundantly after fires on the Kenai, but noticed that it was taking it longer to come in than previous years. And increased forest fires could also threaten mushrooms. So like in California, for example, fires have gotten so intense that even some fire-dependent species of mushrooms like morels are having difficulty regenerating after a fire passes through. And then last but not least, we have seaweed. So residents are highly concerned about seaweed. They noted that in the last 10 years, it's been less and less prevalent. And people even mentioned having to go out and purchase processed seaweed rather than the more traditional option of picking it from rocks. And then I believe Raven is talking next.
I was actually going to jump in and wrap up really quickly before passing it off to Raven. Thanks, Allison. So yes, as you can see, residents and the people that we spoke to and the people that answered the survey have all mostly have noted changes happening and are aware that there could be impacts on traditional foods. So what does this mean for our communities? Well, there are very direct links between climate change and health, as this diagram depicts. So climate change creates exposure pathways for risks to human health, which combined with the environmental institutional context and social and behavioral contexts of a given situation can create different health outcomes. So in the case of subsistence, climate drivers are impacting traditional resources and will likely to continue to impact them in the future. Subsistence creates potential exposure and sensitivity to climate drivers, but it's also an important aspect of resilience in Alaska Native communities. Traditional harvesting provides a number of positive health outcomes that impact individual and community health. It helps promote physical health, both by keeping people active and through a reduced likelihood of certain diseases linked with Western diets. It also helps promote mental health by providing a pathway for people to connect with their culture and community through teaching, learning, and sharing. So it's really important to our community members that they maintain this connection to food and land, and thus our emphasis on food sovereignty in our climate program. So because subsistence is so important to health and well-being in our region, one of the goals of our climate program is to reduce the negative impacts of climate change on subsistence foods, while also identifying opportunities that climate change might bring to expand harvests or to adopt new practices for local food. So as we wrap up our vulnerability stage, we're moving into future activities that kind of fall into 3 buckets, and we'll focus on a couple of these, or my colleagues will focus on a couple of these. So I'm not going to go super into depth, but I will talk about these buckets that we have for our next steps. So the first kind of category we have is engaging the communities and land managers to provide governance in a dynamic climate. It's important that tribal communities have a say in how they adapt to climate change, and that managers are engaging with tribes to make decisions that affect tribal health and well-being. So we also want to monitor resources so that we can know if our programs are having an impact, and also where we need to focus our attention and what resources might be at risk. So this allows us to provide warnings about potentially harmful conditions in subsistence food, and also understand how subsistence resources are reacting to climate change. And finally, we need to take action by doing projects that help support food sovereignty in a changing climate. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Raven to talk a little bit about our marine mammal program and how that relates to climate change.
Thanks, Erin. Yeah, the Chugach Regional Resource Commission is working closely with our member tribes to promote tribal sovereignty while protecting their subsistence and cultural and economic needs through sustainable marine management. We're currently have funding to build capacities to manage the marine mammals within the region and work on issues like blood quantum and that inhibit the continuation of cultural heritage and traditions to younger generations. So as it was said before, where with the Exxon Valdez oil spill coming about and causing a lot of concern that they weren't sharing that knowledge because of being unable to hunt. Now we're experiencing a decline in blood quantum in our younger generations, which is causing now legal matters to make people scared that they're going to become criminals by sharing that information. SERC is also providing technical assistance to tribes regarding marine mammal issues and advocating for a proactive approach to management while emphasizing all tribal involvement at every stage of the research, development, and implementation. This Chugach Regional Resource Commission Marine Mammal Program is working on strengthening the roles of our tribes by creating co-management agreements with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and National Marine Fisheries Service. They aren't in the works yet, and we're working on compiling existing harvest data and by community and species and documenting traditional ecological knowledge so that we can become prepared in making really well thought out, methodical plan for the region. We're working collaboratively with ADF&G to compile that existing harvest data on harbor seals, stellar sea lions, and sea otters. And right now we're just looking at the gaps of information and the shortfalls that are present. Along with the work and research already happening, we like to evaluate the effects of climate change on marine mammals and how that specifically affects hunting based on traditional knowledge. Like it's been said, with the use of marine mammal harvesting coming back and the use of marine mammals and like with skin sewing and things like that, more people are starting to utilize the mammals. And I think it's anytime you got to start now to get that kind of information so that we can have a great research project to lengthen that information for that co-management plan later on. As SERC ensures these protections, we are simultaneously working on the continuity of our subsistence lifestyle and having a stable marine ecosystem, even though we're recovering from Exxon still. Next slide, please. There are over 1,000 tribal members that are living in these communities, all located in the Prince William Sound and Lower Cook Inlet area. We are widely recognized that marine mammal the marine air and water temperatures have drastically been changing over the past 20 years. The rate of change has been quite fast and nobody has experienced anything like this before. These changes are posing a huge threat on our marine ecosystems, creatures, and humans. As sea levels are rising, coastal erosion, ice melt, and ocean acidification are becoming more prevalent in the Chugach region. We must assess the resiliency as more scenarios can be envisioned. Additionally, Alaska Native communities in the Prince William Sound, Lower Cook Inlet, Chugach region depend on marine mammals for subsistence, cultural, and economic fulfillment. It is important to engage in these long-term conversations and planning efforts to ensure the continuity of our species.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Raven. So I'm going to talk really quickly about our Intertribal Subsistence Alliance, which the full name of it is quite a mouthful, South Central Intertribal Subsistence Cooperative Management Alliance. So this is a group that was formed in 2020 to provide education and advocacy support for state and federal subsistence regulations. SERC works with interested tribal members to provide training, on the processes involved with entities like the Board of Fish and Game, Federal Subsistence Board, North Pacific Fisheries Management Council, Marine Mammal Commission, and others, which can just be very daunting and inaccessible to those unfamiliar with these layers of management that exist over subsistence resources. In addition, we track and monitor proposals and actions that could impact access to subsistence and work with tribal citizens to develop and gain support for local proposals. Finally, we work with local land managers and our tribes to identify projects of mutual interest that could enhance subsistence opportunity, improve land managers' knowledge of local conditions on and around their jurisdiction, and provide work experience and training opportunities for tribal citizens in natural resource management. So to name a couple of examples of that, right now we're trying to look at, we're trying to get programs started looking at crab populations in Kachemak Bay, as well as moose populations around, moose and goat populations around Kenai Fjords National Park. So going back to that same image that I showed before, just because I really like this image as a good example of how change can happen. So thinking about how does this program relate to climate change adaptation? So there is the potential for a lot of landscape change, but jurisdictions don't change as easily as landscapes might. We've got a lot of this bureaucracy that has layers of ownership and require a lot of navigating of legal and official channels in order to make change. So plants and animals, like people, adapt as they are able to. So as landscapes change, plants and animals that are available are likely to change as well. For example, heavier snowfalls like happened this year in Prince William Sound drove deer down to the beach where they were easy prey. And also it was really easy for hunters to get them. So we heard a lot about quite high deer harvest this winter. Our current management system for subsistence hunting and fishing requires extensive time and commitment to understand these processes to affect change. So I mentioned one of our projects is we want to look at moose harvests around the Kenai Fjords National Park. We've been working on extending that, not in Kenai Fjords National Park, but the 15C moose season for about 5 years. As those seasons get later and later, it's become harder for our tribal citizens and our hunters to get those moose. And I think that the average kill date, if I remember correctly, has moved from mid-September, about September 11th or September 12th, to the last day of the season, September 30th. So for moose that are part of this permit or this drawing hunt, they may not seem like a lot to managers, but they're really important to our Southern Kenai tribes. And so we want to make sure that that resource is healthy and abundant, but also that tribes are able, or that our local tribes are able to get the moose that they have traditionally subsisted on. Additionally, state and federal land managers drive the development of scientific inquiry and research priorities for fish and wildlife management. Oftentimes they overlook indigenous perspectives and observations. We are trying to also kind of raise bring our tribal citizens to the table in helping to guide what research is done in our region to understand changes and impacts on subsistence foods. So finally, I wanted to note that there's a difference between food security, which is having enough to eat, and food sovereignty, which is having access to and control over the production of healthy and culturally appropriate foods. So ANCSA abolished Aboriginal title to fish and wildlife resources, and it has not been reinstated. So federal subsistence law acknowledges a rural priority, but not an indigenous one. The state of Alaska grants equal access to resources to all citizens. So we really have to know the system and understand it in order to make sure that our tribes are able to have access to traditional foods, and especially in such a populated area as South Central Alaska, that there's not overharvest. It's a very difficult balance. So food sovereignty is an important component of adaptive capacity in a changing environment. But quite frankly, it's unachievable for our tribes in the current management system in Alaska without more ability to harvest traditional foods. So last but definitely not least, I would like to turn it over to Stephen to talk a little bit about one of our a couple of our monitoring programs that looks at subsistence health around the region, or food health around the region.
Yeah, I'm Stephen Payton. I'm the IGAP coordinator for Chugach Regional. So first, I'm going to talk about our dissolved inorganic carbon sampling program. So through the EPA IGAP program, we train community residents. Sorry, I'm losing track here already. So we train our IGAP coordinators from member villages to take these water samples, and then they are shipped back to the Chugach Pride Marine Institute. And there we have a state-of-the-art carbon chemistry laboratory with a machine called a percolator. This machine is used to analyze dissolved inorganic carbon in these samples. And what that'll show us is what level the pH is at, and as I mentioned, the amount of dissolved inorganic carbon. So I'm sure we've all heard of ocean acidification. It's a decrease in pH in the ocean. As this goes on, you can see in the picture of the butter clams below how the shell's becoming more dappled there. Basically, as this goes on, it's going to be harder for marine animals that create shells to create their shells. And this will range from pteropods to king crab and everything in between. And that has big effects because, as in, pteropods are at the bottom of the food chain. They're like a favorite of salmon. So it has, this has big implications for all sorts of our marine resources. And scientists estimate that the ocean is 30% more acidic today than it was 300 years ago, and that's only going to continue to increase. So with this network of ocean acidification samples being taken and all the data that we get, we give it back to the community members so that they can see how it's changing in each community. And this is going to help researchers and the community members, the villages, come up with ways to adapt and possibly even buffer this changing CO2 and pH, and hopefully protect our marine resources. Go to the next slide. So our harmful algal bloom sampling program is just getting off the ground. And so as ocean temperature increases, we're expecting harmful algal blooms to increase also, and they're going to become more frequent. So there are three main types of shellfish poisoning. Usually when we're talking about HABs, people reference PSP. So there's paralytic shellfish poisoning, which is PSP. There's amnesic shellfish poisoning, and there's diuretic shellfish poisoning. These all come from different plankton. They produce the toxins that create these different shellfish poisonings. So much like the dissolved inorganic carbon sampling program, we provide local residents with equipment that they need to perform the sampling, and we also provide training so that they're comfortable doing this on their own in the communities. They go out and they take a sample on a weekly basis, and then they send that sample into the Chugach Pride Marine Institute again. There, it's going to be examined under a microscope. And at this time, they're pretty much just looking for whether harmful algae is absent, present, or in a bloom stage or abundant. And then we're going to disseminate that data back to the village. And we try and do this as quickly as possible. So if we got a sample that came back and was in a bloom state, we would immediately contact that community sampler and we would ask them to collect, first off, want them to inform the community that there's high levels of a potentially harmful algae. So they could go about that however they want. We've had it happen here in Seldovia, and we work with the DEC and some other local organizations. We put flyers out in harvest areas saying that there's high levels of the algae. So at that point, then we have the sampler collect actual shellfish from the area. In the future, we're going to have bags with blue mussels in them, because blue mussels take up these toxins really fast and they get rid of them really fast also. So they're really good indicators of if shellfish are likely to have these toxins in them. So they collect these, they send them to the Eludic Pride Marine Institute again. And then they actually test the tissue of the shellfish for these toxins. We can tell you how much, if there's a potentially dangerous amount in them. So again, like this is creating an early warning system for our community, for the residents, so that people, Alaska's a harvest at your own risk state for shellfish. There's no, like state or federal program out there to say whether a beach is potentially dangerous to, to harvest shellfish from. So this way we can kind of take this into our own hands, communities can, and they can make informed decisions and let people know whether it's safe or not. It's not, 100% science. Like you can't say that 100%, but you can make a pretty well informed decision on it. I think that's all I've got for that.
Sorry, I didn't mean to switch you before you did that. Thanks so much, Stephen. That was a great overview of those monitoring programs. That's it. So thank you everybody for listening. We're happy to take questions. And if you want to follow up with us, our contact information is up here. Please feel free to follow up with any of us as well.
That was a great presentation by the four of you. We do have about 8 minutes left in this session. For the audience, if you'd like to unmute yourself and pose questions or comments to our speakers, please go ahead.
Hi, this is Sina Allen from Kodiak. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Awesome.
Go ahead.
So I really had a quick question about the testing for paralytic shellfish poisoning. Right now, my understanding is that there's a time delay between knowing whether or not an area is potentially at risk. Is there any talk in the future or has there been any advancements of like having tests that could be available for communities for kind of real-time assessment of that?
Yeah, that's a good question. There has been. Been doing this for a long time, and I've seen a couple different tests come around, people to actually use out in the field, because I mean that would be ideal. Is you go out, collect your own clams, whatever. You could take a sample out, take some of it and test it, however, and be able to know right then and there that your shellfish are safe or not. None of them really made it past, that like test phase. I know right now, there's still testing going on, but currently there's there's nothing there. But yeah, it is something people are looking at and hoping to be able to do.
Awesome, thanks.
Anybody else in the audience here would like
I
to
actually had one more
Go-
question, if no one else
go ahead,
does.
Cian?
So
No problem.
I was thinking about what you had said about rising, or I guess lowering pH levels in our oceans and how that's impacting everything. And I was curious about the impacts of like increased kelp production and the kelp farming, if there's any ideas around whether some of those types of mariculture could actually help improve our oceans.
Yeah, so everything I'm aware of shows that kelp can be used, does show potential, as a buffer for this. So yeah, there's the ideas that you could create a kelp farm or something in front of a harvesting area for clams, or even create a clam garden area where there's already a lot of kelp, and it'll create this kind of buffer area for them there, and you could have potentially healthier population of clams there. I think there's some other things that people are looking at to do the same thing, but kelp is a good one. Yeah, for a little while I feel like I was hearing that seagrass could do the same thing, but lately they've been seeing that it actually has the opposite effect, which makes sense because you don't see a whole lot of clams in seagrass.
There's definitely some research here too. We're seeing a lot of people pop up with kelp farms, like small businesses and whatnot, and they're noticing that the pairing of oysters and kelp farming is really beneficial for those areas that they're doing this in, and it's mainly over like on the other side of Orca Inlet, so like on Gravina, that side of the sound, which is the western side. They've also found that with salmon, and we've been noticing like salmon having a hard time finding their natal streams because of this, is that they're using kelp in front of hatcheries as an example and growing it to help baby salmon be able to find their natal streams with the use of kelp right in front of their stream beds.
Yeah, and that's an interesting thing to bring up. Can't remember if I even touched on it earlier. I was going to, but yeah, the increase in CO2 is shown to have effects on things from salmon to darkies, all sorts of marine resources. So like fish, they don't sense predators as well, and the same thing for darkies and limpets. I've seen that with them.
Awesome, thanks for that, guys.
Okay, so what's next? Are you looking for more funding to carry this forward? Because usually it's like a stop and go process where you get grant money and you do a select amount of work, and then afterwards, if you want to do follow-up work, it probably requires more grant assistance. Are you looking for more funding?
We are actually funded for another 2 years to develop a climate adaptation plan. So we're working on developing a climate cohort, we call it, which are going to be advisors from each community who will help us. Actually, it's kind of three things. One, they will help us determine those community determinants of health that we would like to monitor and kind of figure out what are you know, what are measurements of a resilient community and how do we measure that? So that's one line. They're also going to help us develop and brainstorm and prioritize an adaptation plan to address some of the challenges that were brought up in this presentation today and that they raised in the vulnerability assessment part of the project. And then we're also going to be working with them to understand kind of what data needs are out there and try to develop some sort of tool or data portal that can help transmit information to tribes about climate change, especially, you know, for decision makers to base decisions on. So something like that, you know, ideally we'd be able to plug in as real time as possible with the harmful algal bloom research that we're doing and things like that, and just have some sort of data portal for regional climate change. So that's kind of the next 1.5 to 2 years for our project. And after that, you know, as you've noticed, we've already started some of the implementation of some of the high priority needs that we identified even as we were completing the vulnerability assessment. But we really hope to move into implementation. And that's when we're going to be looking for more grants and more funding for that implementation phase.
And then just to follow up real quick, we're almost out of time. Are you partnering with the Alaska Ocean Observatory system where they're going to be they're housing all of this data? And just wondering if you're making that available for them as they're looking at all of Alaskan waters, and then you have one piece of the pie.
I think Stephen can answer that better than me, but I think we already do. Yes, Stephen?
Yeah, we partner with AUS.
Well, great. On that note, I'd like to thank Aaron, Allison, Raven, and Stephen for a great panel discussion. Continued success in your work and efforts. And I think that concludes this session because we're now going to a break, but there are more presentations afterwards. Thank you again.